Good morning. I'll be filling in for Chairman Aderholt briefly in my role as Vice Chairman of the subcommittee and kicking us off with the opening statement. The Chairman will be joining us shortly. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that there are a lot of hearings going on this morning, both on our committee and, of course, on the other side of the Capitol. Members will be coming and going as we try to manage our time and assignments to these other subcommittees. Please be courteous as you enter and exit the room. So the subcommittee will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to the Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee 6th hearing for 2017, where we will examine the fiscal year 2018 budget request for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. As mentioned in previous hearings, 4 primary goals have been established for this subcommittee as we progress through the fiscal year 2018 appropriations process. The first goal is evaluating and accounting for taxpayer dollars to ensure efficiency and accountability. Second is investing in rural infrastructure as a catalyst for growth. Third is ensuring support for the American farmers, ranchers, and producers. And lastly, protecting the health and safety of people, plants, and animals. What began as a small agency nestled within the United States Department of Agriculture is now a $250 million independent regulatory agency that oversees the futures, swaps, and options markets. The Commission's budget has grown 123% in just a few short years, and there has now been a constant stream of activity related to the fiscal matters at the Commission. Acting Chairman Giancarlo, thank you for being here with us today. We hope the Senate can swiftly confirm you as the permanent chairman. As part of our question and answer session, we will discuss the President's fiscal year 2018 budget request of $250 million and other matters related to the Commission. There is no doubt that your agency and its budget have been the subject of much discussion over the past few years. Many of the matters that will be discussed today occurred on someone else's watch. Frankly, the previous administration handed you an agency with a wide assortment of problems that stem from political games being played with the CFTC's budget and employees. The President's budget request clearly laid out a flat funding level for $250 million. I will briefly acknowledge that in both your prepared testimony and your congressional justification, you are requesting $281.5 million for fiscal year 2018. However, as in past years, this number will be considered as your annual, quote, passback submission to the Office of Management and the Budget and nothing more, as you are required by law. The President's budget will be the main topic of our discussion today, and examining it, we can use the detailed information provided for fiscal year 2017 as our guide for reaching the request of $250 million. Some of the topics we will cover today include management and labor issues, such as the recent labor negotiation impasse that occurred between CFTC and its union. Due to what could be called a loophole in federal labor laws, CFTC is one of the few federal agencies that is required to negotiate with its union over personnel, compensation, and benefits. The negotiation in 2016 almost resulted in CFTC employees having to be furloughed for 17 days. This discrepancy in labor laws allows employee, unions, or leaders in government to place civil servants at the mercy of aggressive negotiation tactics and attempts to coerce Congress to provide more funding. There is no guarantee that providing the CFTC an increase would further your major priorities, such as improving economic analysis or the financial technology sector. Without addressing the inclusion of salaries and benefits in collective bargaining negotiations, I fear that instead an increase would simply be absorbed into maintaining the status quo. By government standards, your employees are already paid substantially higher than average, and this allowed you to recruit very qualified employees. Mr. Giancarlo, I know this did not happen under your watch, but it is possible that it could happen again. I would prefer that neither you nor this committee have to deal with it. I also know that this committee is exhausted with the rumors of furloughs at the agency. Last year, during this negotiation, it was the second time in the last few years that the CFTC has said it would be forced to furlough employees unless it received more money. The first occurred in 2013. Both times the solution was clearly attainable and furloughs were unnecessary. I look forward to discussing this matter. Additionally, I hope to get the chance to discuss other issues such as your leasing costs and plans for the remainder of the current fiscal year. The entirety of the federal government is facing fiscal challenges, and the Commission is unlikely to be exempt. I also look forward to covering issues related to the regulations and policies coming out of the CFTC. I'm optimistic about what your Commission will be able to accomplish in the years and months ahead to help our nation's farmers, ranchers, and producers. Your recent statement regarding the future of the agency and its direction is refreshing. Finding the right mix of regulation while still allowing our economy to grow is new to many people who have experienced the overregulation of the last 8 years. I am also encouraged by your recent initiative in the financial technology space to work with industry instead of against it, to find an appropriate balance between regulation and cooperation. This committee has been a big proponent of investing in information technology at your agency and has a history of including funding set aside for this very purpose at the Commission. One particular area of regulation that needs revising is the swap dealer de minimis level. End users that were never intended to be subject to the thousands of regulatory requirements that come with being a swap dealer have been anxiously awaiting the automatic 60% reduction in this level for years. Hopefully, we can find a permanent solution for this issue. I look forward to discussing these and other matters with you, and there is a lot of work before this Congress, the administration, and your agency to get our economy moving again. I hope you would agree that a fully functioning and thriving derivatives market can coexist with adequate controls and without overly burdensome regulations. As this administration begins to implement its policies and restore order to the Commission, I hope we can identify those areas that need to be addressed and begin working towards solutions. Again, I want to thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to our discussion. Now, let me ask our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Bishop, if he has any opening remarks. Mr. Bishop.
A lot of members who are not on this subcommittee may have never heard of the CFTC. The agency itself was founded in 1974, but it has a much longer history that began about 1922 when Congress put USDA in charge of administering grain futures. Given its origins in USDA, I'm happy that we still have jurisdiction over CFTC in our subcommittee. Representing the Agriculture District, I'm very much aware of CFTC's continued relevance to our farmers and ranchers, as well as other industries who use financial instruments to hedge their risk. Turning to your budget, I want to thank you for submitting a budget request that, based on our previous discussions, is based on what is needed to perform the important CFT mission and strays away from legacy areas that may be unnecessary in today's environment. At $281.5 million, it's below the average of requests from 2011 through 2017, which were about $303 million. But it's still a healthy increase over the $250 million that the agency has received for the past 3 years. But it's still, when you look at, though, the historical scope and the exigencies in the financial world, the year 2008 was devastating for our country. Let me just briefly note the damage that was done. We lost about 8.5 million jobs. The unemployment rate increased from 4.7% to 10.1% in October 2009. 10 million families lost their homes, and nearly 250,000 small businesses had to close their doors for good. In response, Congress dramatically expanded CFTC's responsibilities in the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which we called the Dodd-Frank. I always agreed with our former colleague, Congressman Sam Farr of California, in categorizing the CFTC as a financial first responder, as Congress would never deprive first responders of the resources necessary to perform their duties. Unfortunately, CFTC has been held at the same $250 million funding level since 2015. Which makes performing your duties as a financial first responder very difficult. especially when it comes to the daunting task of assuring the economic utility of the futures markets by, one, encouraging their competitiveness and efficiency, two, ensuring their integrity, three, protecting market participants against manipulation, abusive trading practices, and fraud, and four, ensuring the financial integrity of the clearing process. I find this particularly ironic since CFTC has more than paid for itself. Between 2006 and 2014, actual fines collected against wrongdoers were more than 175% greater than the agency's budget during that entire period. I'd like to take this time to thank you for working across the aisle and reaching out not only to me as ranking member, but also to my colleagues on the subcommittee. We hear reports of departments and agencies being non-responsive to Congress and making the operation of the country appear to be a partisan circus. But I'm glad that the departments and agencies that are under our subcommittee have stayed above the fray, remaining professional, collaborative, and focused on their respective missions. Look forward to your testimony today and an increased understanding of the identified needs to make CFTC successful of our country's farmers, ranchers, and other businesses, and giving them the ability to manage costs and hedge risk, and as a result, positively impacting the price that Americans pay for food, energy, and other goods and services. Mr. Vice Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to welcome the acting chairman, and at this time, I will yield back.
Well, Acting Chairman Giancarlo, without objection, your entire written testimony will be included for the record. I will recognize you now for your statement, and then we will proceed with questions.
Good morning, Vice Chairman. Thank you. Good morning, Vice Chairman, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of the subcommittee. And thank you for this opportunity to testify on the CFTC fiscal year 2018 budget. As you know, for more than 100 years, American farmers and ranchers have used derivative markets to hedge their costs of production and their delivery price. It assures that we Americans can find plenty of food on grocery store shelves. But derivative markets are not just helpful for agricultural producers. They influence the price and availability of heating in American homes, electric power in offices and factories, interest rates on homeowners' mortgages, and returns on retirement savings. These markets allow producers to manage changing production costs, like the price of raw materials, energy, foreign currency, and interest rates. They enable business risk to be transferred from those who can't bear it to those who can. And they free up capital for investment and boost economic growth, job creation, and American prosperity. Yet today, in a number of ways, these markets are more fragmented, more concentrated, less liquid, and less supportive of economic growth than in the past. The overly prescriptive regulation of American derivative markets is part and parcel of the overregulation of the U.S. economy that thwarts broad-based prosperity. The time has come for these markets and the efforts of those of us who regulate them to be put more fully in service to the American economy. Turning to our budget request, a request that was approved by both the Republican and the Democrat member of our commission, the CFTC is requesting $281.5 million and 739 FTEs for fiscal year 2018. This is an increase of $31.5 million and 36 FTEs over the fiscal year 2017 level. The $31.5 million in additional funds is not an ad hoc number, but a careful assessment of what the CFTC needs to execute its mission in fiscal year 2018. Now, I recognize the enormous task of setting the federal government's $4 trillion budget, and I respect the priorities of this Congress and President Trump to balance the budget rather than pile up more debt on American citizens. And I know this committee's essential role in appropriating and allocating the resources provided to it by our fellow Americans. Therefore, we did not take lightly the use of bypass authority to present our 2018 budget directly to Congress. Now, this is my first time directing a federal agency and its budgeting process. Previously, I spent 30 years in the private sector, whereas last, a senior executive of a public company. And from that perspective, it seemed to me that the budgeting process of government agencies always started with last year's number, to which was added an additional percentage. When I became acting chairman a few months ago, I approached the budget differently, the way I did back in business. I sat down with the heads of every unit, I reviewed their missions and their spending, and together we built this budget up from zero, based upon real needs and expenditures. Now, no surprise, I found areas where the agency can be more efficient. For example, by returning to regular order in our operations. That means taking greater care and precision in our rule drafting, adopting less contracted timeframes for public comment to our rule proposals, and reducing the docket of new rules and regulations to be absorbed in a short period of time by market participants. We're also looking to reestablish the agency's core structure as a central service agency. We're not going to over-interpret our mission, and we're going to share duties with other federal agencies and self-regulatory organizations. Well, I hope that by implementing these changes, I could have reduced our 2018 budget request, perhaps below prior year levels, or even held it steady. But it will take some time to see these efficiencies realized in our budget. But instead, I also discovered 3 critical areas where the agency falls short of its mission. These are the Commission's budget priorities for fiscal year 2018, and they explain the modest increase in our budget request. First, our Office of Chief Economist is under-resourced currently to meet the challenges of the rapidly changing nature of global derivative markets. We must conduct more thorough cost-benefit and economic analysis to support better regulatory policy. Second, as clearinghouses grow in size and scope, so too has the complexity of the counterparty risk management oversight programs and procedures of the firms we regulate. Ben Franklin said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The better our process of examining derivatives clearinghouses, the less taxpayers are at risk of bailing them out if something goes wrong. So we must strengthen our examinations capacity to keep pace with the explosive growth in the amount and value of cleared swaps here and abroad. And third, and finally, to avoid being a 20th century analog regulator of new 21st century digital markets, the CFTC must keep pace with emerging technology. Our world is changing. Our parents' financial markets are gone. A digital transformation is well underway in our markets and shows no sign of stopping. For this reason, we've launched something called Lab CFTC, an important financial technology initiative that will help our agency catch up with the changing nature of markets for which it is responsible. So in conclusion, U.S. derivative markets should be neither the most regulated nor the least regulated in the world, but the best regulated. Providing effective oversight and robust enforcement of our laws motivates the talented men and women of the CFTC. The standard of our agency is operational and regulatory excellence. Our proposed budget will meet this standard for the American people. It will allow the CFTC to keep pace with innovation and oversee risk transfer markets that are durable and competitive here and abroad. I submit my written testimony for the record and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by taking a look to the future. Over the past 8 years, many of us have been consistently challenged with your agency's policies, actions, and decision-making. Your budget was used as a political tool to convince people that Republicans were in the tank for Wall Street. CFTC would oftentimes ignore input from businesses and that wanted to do the right thing on new regulations. The President has laid out several executive orders to provide for reforms. These reforms include a review of the core principles of financial regulation and a proposal for reorganization of agencies to achieve greater efficiencies and effectiveness. Mr. Giancarlo, I want to get your thoughts on how you plan to change the direction of the agency, both in terms of policy and management. And can you tell me how you are complying with the President's executive orders and also how you plan to implement your own initiatives and ideas for the future of the agency? And in the past, CFTC measured success by the amount of fines and penalties imposed in the private sector. What types of outcome-based performance measures do you plan to put in place?
Thank you very much. And I think your comment about how to measure success is a very important one. I think the right way to measure the success of an agency like the CFTC is whether U.S. derivative markets attract the world's capital because the world recognizes them to be the most durable, the most vibrant, but also the most stable and the best regulated. There's a reason why the world flocks to U.S. IPO markets. The reason why capital from all over the world wants to have their initial public offerings in the United States. It's not because our regulations for public companies are in any way lax. In fact, most people would say that the requirements for a public offering in the United States are some of the most stringent. But the real reason capital flocks here is because they're perceived to be the best combination of sensible regulation, of transparency, but also flexibility. Capital will go where the rules are the best. They will not go where they're the most lax. They will not go where they are the most unreasonably stringent. They will go where they're the best. And I think derivative markets, by their very nature, are global in scope. If we operate the best markets, we will see the capital attracted to those markets, and those markets will flourish. And that's how I would measure success for the agency. As an overseer of those markets, are we developing the best rules and the best policies to make our markets attract global capital?
And on the first part of that question, how you're complying with the President's executive orders and how you plan to implement your own initiatives and ideas for the future of the agency.
So to that end, in terms of making our rules the best, one of the things that I think is required, not just in a federal agency, but quite frankly in any operation, is to occasionally step back and take a look at your rules and see whether rules that have accumulated over dozens of years, in the case of the CFTC, 4 decades, still are relevant and still make sense. And so we've launched a new initiative at the CFTC, which I've called Project KISS. It goes back to something my father used to say when I was a young man, and that was, keep it simple, stupid. And sometimes you just need to take a look at your rule set and say, are they still relevant? Do they still make sense for the current times? And if they do, is the agency applying them in a way that is just straightforward? It's not a matter of necessarily changing policy, but is the application of the policy make sense? So we've launched this initiative. We're looking at our rule sets to see whether they are applied in a way that is the least burdensome, the least costly, and the least drag on the economy. We've identified a number of areas, and with the support of my fellow commissioner, Commissioner Bowen, we've announced 2 new reapplications of some of our existing law already. In one case, we've gone back at a record-keeping requirement and taken out of it some technology requirements that are decades old in terms of the technology used, and made those rules technologically neutral. So what we're trying to do at the agency is regulate in a way that is just more streamlined and better without necessarily having to rewrite the rule, but can we apply it in a simpler fashion?
All right, thank you. My time's about expired, so I'm going to give it over to our ranking member, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Giancarlo, I'd like to commend you again for exercising your legal authority in submitting CFTC's budget request directly to Congress. You've stated that this $281.5 million request is based on a bottom-up requirements identification. The systems engineering approach is advisable for all departments, and of course I applaud you for doing so. However, with the past 2 years of flat funding, I want to make sure that CFTC is advocating for what's required to perform your very important mission. For example, in FY17, CFTC requested $42.29 million for data and technology support. But now in FY18, you're requesting an additional $43.59 million for the same mission function. Was the FY18 requests for data and tech support submitted because FY17 was completed halfway into the fiscal year, or is the additional $43.59 million absolutely required to complete the IT uplift? And I'm asking because Congress has seen a lot of hard-earned tax dollars spent on IT that hasn't met the projected return on investment. So we want to know if we're applying the funds appropriately here.
One of the things I discovered upon taking over as acting chairman is that the way the agency goes about defining its technology needs within the agency really doesn't accord with best practices in the private sector. When I was an executive in a public company, no technology would either be purchased or built without a proper internal specification process. That would be that the internal customer, say a division of market oversight, would go to our Office of Data and Technology and say, we need the following technology to do our mission. Previously, that would just be built without a lot of documentation, without a lot of careful specification at the agency. Now, where I was in the private sector, that couldn't be the case. There would have to be a careful back and forth process, and everything would be written down. And the reason why that's important is accountability. Once that technology is then delivered, if the internal buyer of it said, well, it doesn't work for me, the builder of it can say, well, it meets the specification, you agreed to the specification. They'll provide accountability. We haven't engaged at the agency in a proper specification. And so I'm a little cautious in speaking to previous budgets for technology because I don't believe they were done to the rigor that I think they deserve and I think that the American taxpayer deserves. So going forward within the agency, we will not complete technology builds without a specification process. Now the total, if I have the figure correctly, the total amount we are asking for in our 2018 budget is $57 million. Some of that includes some new build, and some of that includes just the escalation in costs for systems we already deploy with renewed licenses and the cost of technologies going up. But I've been through that $57 million with our staff, and I believe that with proper specifications going forward, that is a real hard number that we will be able to live with and will meet our technology needs quite adequately.
Thank you. I want to get to a question that may not be quite as long. Let me ask you about diversity. You have heretofore indicated that diversity was a goal, and I was glad to see that CFTC began targeting outreach to minority-serving institutions, such as HBCUs, to identify future candidates for internship opportunities. You and I discussed this when we met in March, and at that time, funding wasn't allocated that would allow for internships to be CFTC-paid experiences. It wasn't clear from the budget request. Has this funding been accounted for within the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion portion of the budget? If not, we stand ready to connect you with programs that would allow you to reach out to excellent HBCUs such as Fort Valley State, Albany State, South Carolina State, Morehouse College, Howard University, Tuskegee University, that produce high-caliber graduates in finance as well as agriculture economics fields. Is it your intent to have these introductory internship opportunities progress into permanent full-time employment for these students? Because you will have invested money in them, and it seems like it would be a waste if you did not take advantage of that investment. Can you describe your strategic workforce plan that includes increasing minorities and women in positions at CFTC?
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member. I'm very pleased that since we met you, since I met with you a month or so ago, we've been able to progress that initiative or outreach to historically minority and underrepresented communities. And in fact, we extended 18 offers for summer internships and received 11 acceptances. We now have 11 terrific candidates at the agency. In fact, if I might, at the risk of embarrassing him, introduce you to one of our summer interns, Zach Shepard, who's here, is a student at Howard Law School, and really we were lucky to get him and 10 other students who will be with us this summer. But I think your point is extremely well taken. It's one thing to recruit interns. It's another thing altogether to see them as the basis for our future hiring needs and bring them into the organization. That is something we very much intend to do. We look upon this program as not something that's just a one-time thing. It's something we want to use as the basis for our future workforce. And to that end, we also have the capability built into our budget to pay our interns for their service to the agency. So we will, if the committee sees fit to grant our budget, we will look to do that.
Thank you. My time is up.
I'd like to recognize gentleman, Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given the changes over the last several years and how the markets you regulate are traded, or as you put it, the new digital world, how much of your request is for technology resources, not human resources? And I ask because the CME Group, for example, continues to trade more of their product electronically rather than in the trading pits. So manipulation, spoofing, and other market disruptions have grown. While I see the budget includes an increase in funding and for full-time employees, I'm wondering where they are being added, and will the new funding and the new employees be enough for you to do your job to protect farmers and ranchers who utilize futures contracts as a risk management tool?
Thank you for that question. Our amount for our budget increase that we're looking to apply to the areas of FinTech, to the Office of Chief Economist, and to examinations of the clearinghouses that play a central role in this increasing digital marketplace also includes the technologies and the tools they will use to do their functions. One of the challenges of this new digital world is really a deep understanding of where it's going. There's a quote that I like very much by the hockey star Wayne Gretzky. He said the reason he was so successful during his championship years is not because he skated to where the puck was, because he skated to where the puck was going. And I think what this budget request really represents is an effort by us as an agency to try to start skating to where the puck is going. I think in very much a lot of what we've done over the last few years has been somewhat backward-looking, perhaps by necessity, because the backward-looking was to the last crisis, but not sufficiently forward-looking, to my view, as to how these markets are dramatically changing the nature of risk transfer. And if we don't look forward, if we don't look very much forward into the future, I don't think we're going to be able to keep up. And the questions we get repeatedly from farmers and ranchers of what is the impact of high-frequency trading in the markets? What are the roles of algorithms in the markets? And the answers to those things are extremely complicated. The role of these new market participants is truly challenging. And I can't say we yet have all the answers, which is why that I'm looking to bring our level of econometric analysis back up to a historical level. The CFTC decades ago was considered primarily an econometric point of excellence in the federal government, and we've really lost that in the last several decades. And I'd like to bring that back, and that's why we're seeking an increase to our Office of Chief Economist, and we're looking to recruit some of the nation's best economists to come to the agency to help us understand the changing nature of the markets. And they will use a lot of data in their work and a lot of analytical capability, and we've built that into the budget as well.
You mentioned FinTech and specifically blockchain in your testimony. My understanding is that you are excited about the possible application of this technology. How do you see blockchain developing over the next several years, and is the U.S. developing an appropriate set of rules for this new digital universe, and if so, what is the CFTC's role in this?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, we're behind. The United States is behind in blockchain and technology. Let me make that more precise. The U.S. government is behind. Our innovators are state of the art. Some of the best work in blockchain is being done today in New York and Silicon Valley. But as regulators, some of our overseas counterparts are way ahead of us. The British have something called Project Innovate, and it's a unified approach between their Treasury, between their central bank, the Bank of England, and between their Financial Conduct Authority to encourage financial technology innovation, including blockchain, to be done in London and to bring the jobs that innovation brings with it there. A study by PricewaterhouseCoopers looked at financial technology innovation around the globe and rated the U.S. against Europe and said, despite our lead in funding and scientific excellence, Britain is ahead of us because the warm welcome that the regulators give to innovation and the rather indifferent approach we as regulators have taken to it in the United States. Our lab CFTC aims, at least within our own agency, to be a step, we think, in the right direction. And that is, we want to take some of the regulatory risk out of innovators. I was at I'll end here, but I was at a conference in New York recently, and I met a venture funder of technology, and he said that 18 months ago he was prepared to invest in a startup company in New York that was doing some very interesting work, but his diligence showed that they might have a regulatory issue with another financial regulator. I'm happy to say it wasn't us. And he said that 18 months later, they were still waiting for a response to a letter they sent to that regulator as to whether they were subject to that agency's regulation, and therefore he decided not to fund that company. So that's a company that's not going to get funded because a U.S. government agency couldn't give them an answer in 18 months as to whether they were subject to its regulation. Our lab, CFTC, aims to take that regulatory risk by being much more responsive to some of these innovative companies.
That's good. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And Mr. Giancarlo, very nice to meet you. And I really appreciate you explaining the thought process, how you came up with your budget coming into that position new, and thank you for that. That helped to how I can ask some questions. First question I do want to ask is, I know in your short time that you've been in the position you're in, you've developed a very good relationship with your agency's employees. And one of the concerns I think that I'm looking at is, I know you've had a lot of turnover from folks going to either other agencies or the private sector because of the very specialized type of skills they have. You've had some loss, and I know you're looking for a little additional money in the budget to try to, I think, address that. Is that, can you just talk just briefly about that?
Yeah, so I think the turnover we've had, actually, I think it actually may be percentage-wise compared to perhaps other agencies a little bit lower. But, you know, in the change of a government, it's often the case that people will move on to the private sector or to another government agency. So I don't, haven't been either surprised or disappointed in the loss, but we're always looking to bring in quality people, whether they come from the private sector or other government agencies. We built that. The area of the Office of Chief Economist is an area where probably we're asking for the biggest increase. I think it's vitally important that we attract some world-class econometric thinking to these marketplaces that are changing so rapidly and that we so need to get ahead of the curve. And so we do need to be able to offer them, you know, when we compete for talent at the CFTC, we're often competing against the financial sector, and in many cases, I think increasingly against Silicon Valley for the right level of talent. These are these are the world's most sophisticated markets. I mean, with great respect to my colleagues at the SEC, the derivative markets are the world's most sophisticated. And the United States, they are the biggest in the world. We are the world leaders. We are the only country in the world that has a separate regulator devoted just to derivatives. And while some people may say, may challenge that, I think it makes absolute sense because of the sophistication and the complexity of the markets we oversee. Order of magnitude, the over-the-counter swaps market is measured in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. These are extremely complicated markets, and we need very, very sophisticated people to help us
Let me build
oversee.
on that and two questions, if I can, in the derivative area. So, you know, one of my concerns is that, you know, that's part of what brought us to, I think, the financial crisis in 2008. You know, we all have to deal with our constituents who've lost homes during that area. My brother's a circuit court judge in Milwaukee. Every judge had to take time off on Mondays just to deal with foreclosures during that period for months. I mean, it's devastating impact. So this is, you know, really important, I think, to the American people. Two things. One, you talked about the current process you thought was overly prescriptive, but you did also say you didn't want to have the most or the least, you want to have the best regulation. If you could just talk a little bit about that. And then secondly, if the budget request comes in at the level that the president has, not what you're requesting, what does that difference mean to making sure that we've got this market under control?
Okay. So when I say neither the least nor the best, I'm not a foe of regulation. I'm a believer in good regulation. In fact, I support Title VII of Dodd-Frank. I did as it was making its way through Congress. I've done ever since. I've said repeatedly, I think in Title VII, Congress got it right. I've been a critic of some of the CFTC's implementation, but most of it I've been supportive of. But in terms of the swaps provisions, I think got Congress right. Now, I will tell you, I think Congress got it right because it took the best practices from the private sector and embodied them and made them into mandates. The notion of moving bilateral swaps into central clearing was already moving in the private sector. It was the right thing to do, and Congress rightly adopted it as part of Title VII. Similarly, at the heart of the financial crisis was the opacity in what swaps were being held on bank balance sheets and the inability to understand whether, if one bank would fail, whether another one would fall because of their interrelationship in terms of swaps exposure. So reporting swaps transactions to swaps repositories makes sense. Similarly, it was already started in the private sector, but it needed to be advanced, and it's been advanced tremendously since. Requiring swaps transactions take place on licensed transactions absolutely made sense. I think Congress got it right. So I believe with the right regulations, these markets are better for it, and done properly, they can be more stable, more durable, and yet still vibrant at the same time and attract the world's capital. So I think those are all very important objectives, and that's what we aim to do at the CFTC.
Just, you got 15 seconds on the budget side. What if you wound up with the 30-some million or billion less?
Well, it would be a challenge. So the three initiatives that are built into the additional 31 are additional economists, additional examinations people. Our approach to central counterparty clearinghouses is a rigorous process of examinations. The amount of capital, of margin that's gone into these clearinghouses since Dodd-Frank was adopted is in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. And some of that is done in London, and yet we are the London Clearinghouse's primary regulator. We have to have the resources to be able to oversee that clearinghouse. And finally, we wouldn't be able to do our FinTech initiative without these resources as well.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Valdale.
Yeah, as you might know, I represent a rural part of California with an economy that is highly dependent on agriculture. Farmers in my district need to have reliable and efficient markets in order to compete in the global economy. One contributor to market uncertainty, which may negatively affect prices, is how the CFTC investigates and enforces the Commodity Exchange Act and the Dodd-Frank Act. I'm certain you are aware that the House will be voting on the Financial Choice Act later today, and there are a number of ideas related to the SEC operations reforms that were included in the bill, and I believe could also be applied to the CFTC. Of particular concern is the transparency and the enforcement practices of your agency. Have you considered how publishing an enforcement manual could improve regulatory compliance and in turn market certainty? Do you believe that transparent guidelines could help market actors better meet the expectations of the CFTC? And if so, what additional resources would your agency need to achieve this?
Thank you very much. I'm a believer that strong enforcement is a critical part of our regulatory mission. I spent 14 years in the markets, and I'm not naive about how markets operate, and that vigorous enforcement is needed because there are unfortunately always have been and always will be bad actors in the markets. From time to time, regulators need to be seen to be taking those persons out of the markets in order so that the majority of good actors in the markets know that those markets are safe for them to operate. So I think strong enforcement is vitally important. I supported an initiative by the former head of our enforcement division at the end of last year at the CFTC to put forward guidelines for cooperation agreements with registrants and other firms subject to our regulations, where they would self-report wrong behavior that they would become familiar with. Those guidelines have been made public. I believe that the greater the public understands the rules of engagement that we utilize in enforcement, the more they can direct their conduct in a way that is satisfactory to the market. So yes, I do support greater transparency in our rules of engagement.
All right, thank you, and that's all I've got, so I yield back.
Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Giancarlo. Pleasure to be with you today. First of all, let me commend you for fighting for a budget increase. I think it's critically important. I think the continued underfunding of your agency has been a mistake on our part, and as such have fought over the years for increased funding for the CFTC, because I think it does impact your ability to deal with enforcement, to monitor, and surveillance. So I just want you to know that I will be an ally with you in fighting for increased funding for the agency. With that said, let me move to two areas. One is the issue of of regulation. In your opening testimony, you state that, and I quote, "Regulation of American derivative markets is part and parcel of the overregulation of the U.S. economy and thwarts the revival of American prosperity." I looked into the issue, and I talked with several experts in the area. I can't find the evidence to support your claim. Can you say specifically how regulation of the derivatives market held back, quote, "the revival of American prosperity"? And if you can give me hard data on that.
Sure. And I'll point to areas within our oversight at the CFTC. In 2007, there were, I think it was 157 futures commission merchants serving farmers and ranchers and smaller manufacturers in the United States with their hedging needs. We're now down to about a third of that number, serving the same constituents in the markets. And unfortunately, of the 50 or so futures commission merchants that are left, the ones that are serving the lion's share of market participants are several banks on Wall Street. The last 10 years have been devastating for those financial institutions serving smaller market participants. Now, we've seen the same thing in community banks and smaller banks around the country. We're seeing a dwindling number of broker-dealers registered. The intermediaries in markets, especially the ones serving smaller market participants, have been dramatically reduced over the last decade. Now, not all of that is due to regulation.
Right.
Some of that is due to the lack of economic growth in the economy. But some of it has been due to regulation as well. We've had to reverse some of the regulations we imposed on some of these smaller firms because they were just too draconian.
But I would just say to that, and I'll move on to enforcement. You know, it wasn't me, but I think some wise person said that the most dangerous time after a crisis, and we had a crisis, serious crisis, is when things are going well. Because that's when one relaxes and risk again begins to creep in. That may be where human nature takes us, but it does not have to be government policy. And I think we have to be very, very careful here about what we pull back on, so that we don't find ourselves in the same set of circumstances. And we put in place, we had nothing before. Mm-hmm. And so, again, it's the claim that this has thwarted the revival of the American prosperity. In my view, I think it's overstated. And I want to just say that to you.
I understand.
Okay.
The way I look at it is I feel that the reg reform that came out of the financial crisis, I would call it almost like software 1.0. And I think it's now time to go to version 2.0.
If you could give us some hard examples of where, in fact, that would be useful for me, for the committee, I hope, to move past the generalization, but you gave a couple of examples and specific examples of overregulation. I'll start with the enforcement piece here. Your budget makes a startling statement. As a civil law enforcement agency, CFTC has the duty to protect and serve derivative market participants. I would say that the duty of a law enforcement agency is to enforce the law, and this suggests a coziness with industry. That's frankly disturbing to me. Even OMB talks about CFTC's mission as being to protect market users and their funds, consumers, and the public from fraud, manipulation, and abusive practices related to derivatives and other products. So, in your view, which is it? Are we going to serve the market, or are we going to protect the users?
Well, our mission is to oversee markets, and as part of that, we have a strong enforcement capability to go after bad actors who would seek to manipulate or commit fraud or spoof or commit other violations of our rules in the marketplace.
All right, but again, you said, and I read your, CFTC has the duty to protect and serve derivative market participants. Now, again, it's about. Is it about? I think it's the market users that we have to protect, consumers, their funds, and rather than those folks who are directing the derivatives. You seem to agree with
By
that.
participants, I include all participants in the markets, big or small. Farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, as well as larger participants.
Just final comment. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. But the public needs to be protected from fraud, from manipulation, and abusive practices related to derivatives and other products. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Acting Chairman, welcome to the committee. Thanks for your testimony today. It's been very enlightening. I think it also could be said that the greatest risk following a crisis could also be swinging the pendulum too far. And so I think we all agree we need to get this right. We're all here to protect our constituents, small businesses, farmers, people who are trying to create jobs and make America prosperous and create opportunity for everyone. And they can't do that without access to capital. They can't do that without being able to protect risk. They can't do that without liquidity in markets. And so you have a real balance to play here, and it's important, but the goals are the same. And I know my colleague from Connecticut and we share the same goals. We just sometimes disagree about whether the regulations in place might be undermining those goals. Right? So I think that's the challenge we have here, and that's the debate we continue to have on this committee, and we're having it on the floor today in the House. I think you would agree that that regulations that reduce liquidity, regulations that actually create more risk by reducing the amount of participants in markets actually harm our consumers, actually make transactions that they do in our districts and across this country, make those transactions riskier, less protected, less safe. And so we've seen across the country, every day there's less small banks than there were the day before. We see big banks getting bigger. We see, in many cases, consumers not being protected as was laid out in Dodd-Frank. And so I think that's why this Congress attempts to try to get this reform right, to protect those very consumers. One of the items you had mentioned this morning in your just recent back and forth with the committee related to the Futures Commission merchants. I continue to hear concerns from market participants that the supplemental leverage ratio impact on clearing members is causing significant losses, not only with access to central clearing, but also hampering market liquidity by artificially constraining customers who provide liquidity. While I recognize this is not a regulation that your agency put in place, it certainly is having an impact on the markets you regulate. Could you help the committee understand how the CFTC is working with your fellow regulators to find a solution to this growing problem?
Thank you very much. The issue of Futures Commission merchant consolidation is a real issue for America's farmers, ranchers, and smaller manufacturers. Within the past year, we saw the sale of one of America's most storied names in this area, Beige, a name that probably goes back 100 years in providing services to smaller market participants. And when the firm was sold, and they were sold because their owners felt they couldn't make a go at it, thousands of customers were basically let go and forced to find another service provider. And the customers that were let go were the smallest end of the spectrum, the very smaller constituents that I think we are all concerned about. The supplementary leverage ratio, as it's known, is part of the problem that we're seeing with the consolidation of smaller of Futures Commission merchants, because it really falls on them. One of the core reforms to the financial crisis that was agreed by the G20 in Pittsburgh in 2009 and embodied in Title VII of Dodd-Frank was that we would address part of the problem of the crisis by requiring more bilateral swaps to not be on bank balance sheets, but to be into central clearinghouses. That was one of the key reforms. And yet this leverage ratio actually penalizes that very activity. It's counter to our own prioritization of central clearing as one of the ways of addressing the crisis. We have done our own estimate at the CFTC, which I announced a few weeks ago, that if the supplementary leverage ratio were kept but reformed in two very simple ways, it could free up as much as 70% of capital for use of these very smaller market participants that are, as you quite rightly say, Representative, are struggling to be able to utilize adequate trading liquidity in the markets. So yes, the supplementary leverage ratio is something that's very important. It's something that I've shared with the Treasury Secretary, and I'm hoping that some of the other agencies that are responsible for it will see their way fit to making the amendments necessary so we can actually achieve the purposes of Dodd-Frank, achieve the purposes of reg reform, which is greater central counterparty clearing.
I appreciate your leadership there. Briefly, with the time we have remaining, Kansas, that I represent, is the leading wheat-producing state in the country. And after last year's huge crop, we saw a significant spread between farmers' local cash price and the futures price. So not only were farmers having to deal with the futures market with historically low prices, we had farmers that were getting a cash price more than $1 less than was on the board. In April, the CME Group announced that it would implement a variable storage rate on the Kansas City HRW futures contract beginning in March 2018, pending approval from the CFTC. Could you share with us the process CFTC is undertaking considering this request and what your thoughts are about establishing a VSR on the hard red winter wheat?
Thank you for that. In fact, I had the pleasure of visiting Kansas in February and visiting with some of your constituents that farm wheat in the state. And I'm familiar with the issue that you mentioned with regard to the Kansas City wheat contract, the hard red winter wheat contract. We are processing that application. I think it is due by early July. We are on schedule with that application. I feel I understand from our team that's looking at it that's going very well. I expect a successful result in that, and I must commend the CME for listening to concerns of users of that contract and responding to those concerns and taking these steps. And not only that, but we will watch the outcome of this to make sure it solves the problem that's been addressed.
Appreciate your support. Thank you.
Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Giancarlo. I see you're looking at converting notional amounts of swaps into actual measures of risk. This is probably overdue, don't you think? And is that your idea or something that the CFTC has been wanting to do for a while? Or how did this come about where you're really going to take a look at this?
So it's a complicated subject. I think
yeah.
that, and I probably am guilty of something that I find problematic, and I know probably you and your other members do as well, and that is when we refer to these markets, we cite these same astronomical levels of notional value.
$600 trillion market
Absolutely.
is what I hear.
Yeah, yeah. And yet there is no really other way of currently of presenting what that means in terms of real risk to the system. But we need to find a better way. We need to not just cite a big number and say, therefore, the house is on fire, and we all need to do whatever it is that the proponent is calling for.
That's a big number. The world's GDP doesn't even add up to that.
And yet,
so how do you find it?
Yeah, so one of the things that our revised Office of Chief Economist is going to be charged with doing is coming up with better ways of understanding the risk to the financial system that is present in big numbers like that. Now, the number I understand after that $600 trillion has been netted down
So you have a
is
preliminary?
closer to $250 trillion.
Okay.
It's still a ridiculously big number. But what does that really mean in risk to the system? That's something that I don't have an answer for. But as you note, that is something we are going to search for an answer for.
What other tools or who do you reach out to help you find this number? There's some really smart people that work within the government. There's some equally, if not better, smart people on the outside of the government. Can you contract out specialists, quantitative specialists, under your information technology account to kind of line item and bring folks in to achieve this work to find out what that number is?
So our Office of Chief Economist now surveys all the best literature in the field, speaks at all the major important conferences. We welcome in academics. It's always a bit of challenging because we have proprietary data, and we have to be very careful how that data is used and whether it's used by outsiders. Could it be commercialized? Could it be disclosed? So that is always a challenge. We work very carefully with the legal team to make sure we get that right. In our budget request for 15 additional economists, we're going to be looking to bring in nationally and internationally ranked economists who specialize in the area of risk to be able to take these grand numbers and reduce it down to what it really means in terms of risk to the financial system.
Well, I appreciate you looking for taking those steps to find the true size of the market and the tools that you're using, not just internally, but as well as looking at what folks are saying on the outside who are who study these things for a living, right? Keep us posted, and I understand now that you've kind of moved that down to $250 trillion mark. But keep us posted. We all have a vested interest in this, and so thank you for your work on this, and we'll be prepared to have further conversations about this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Sorry I was a little bit late arriving this morning, but thank you for proceeding on with your testimony, and I look forward to getting a chance to visit with you as well. I want to ask about the CFTC swap dealer de minimis regulation. Of course, it sets the threshold of annual financial activity when a market participant must register as a swap dealer, as you well know, and it's scheduled to be automatically reduced to 60% from $8 billion in annual swap activities to $3 billion. Thankfully, your predecessor included a one-year delay on the scheduled reduction, but that revised deadline is fast approaching. So time is of the essence as we address this issue. CFTC has now completed 2 studies on this rule. The vast majority of feedback, as I understand it, as the Commission received, was in favor of maintaining the level of revising it even higher, saying there's no benefit to our economy, no increased protection preventing another financial crisis for allowing this threshold to be reduced. It would only serve to crush our job creators and even more burdensome regulations. The entities that would be captured by the reduction would be the end users of derivatives. They had nothing to do with Wall Street or the financial crisis. In fact, the level set by majority of U.S. financial regulators that subjects financial entities to more stringent regulation is $50 billion. Many even consider that level to be too low. Becoming a swap dealer brings with it 4,000 additional regulatory requirements. Some business just cannot afford this cost, and they would be forced out of the market. In numerous recent appropriation laws, we've included provisions related to this issue, including the recent passed omnibus. One of these provisions directed your agency to keep the swap dealer de minimis level at no less than $8 billion. Preferably, would like to see it higher. Can you talk a little bit about your plans for addressing this issue and whether or not the agency will follow this directive?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate you coming this morning. I know you traveled far to get here, so thank you. Let me just, if I could, just start from sort of first principles and then work down. So one of the reforms that was embodied in Title VII of Dodd-Frank was that the dealing of swaps should be a regulated activity. And it sought to regulate the traditional dealers of swaps, all the household names you'd expect on Wall Street. Well, in fact, we have done that. We have 104 swap dealers registered with us today. So the question of de minimis is really a question of just how far out that goes. Do we go from 104 to 124, but where is the tail end of that set of registrants? It was the Wall Street Reform Act. We have all the Wall Street firms. When we talk about de minimis, we're talking about going way further out into the field, into non-Wall Street firms. We're now talking about firms that their primary business is being a power utility, an electric company, a refinery, a distributor of agricultural products that may have, as a small subcomponent of their business, a market-making activity where they will offer some liquidity into the markets in addition to their own trading activity. I've spoken to most of these firms right now who are keeping their trading activity below the $8 billion simply because they cannot be registered as a swap dealer because it will change their whole business model. Their investors that see them as a power utility will suddenly say, wait a minute, you're a swap dealer? I need to compare you against Goldman Sachs in terms of your earning potential? I won't do it. Their CEOs simply have told their trading operations, you have to stay below the de minimis because we cannot be considered as a competitor to Goldman Sachs. If we lower the de minimis level, all these firms will do is reduce trading to a lower level again. What I fear is by lowering the level, we're not going to go from 104 registrants to 124. We're not even going to go from 104 to 108. I'd be surprised if we go from 104 to 105, because they're all going to lower their trading activity to a lower level to stay out. So we're not going to gain anything, but what are we going to lose? We're going to lose the liquidity they provide, and often they're providing liquidity to the smaller players in the marketplace. Now, I've worked very well with Commissioner Bowen at the commission. She feels differently. She feels it should be lowered, and I respect her thoughtfulness that she brings to these issues. But I've said publicly I don't feel it should be lowered. So right now we are in that situation where she feels it should be lowered. I feel it would be counterproductive to lower it. I don't feel we'll gain any more registrants. I think we'll just force them out of the market. And I don't think that helps anybody. But I do respect her view on this, but that's where we are today.
Quickly, can you provide a timeline of how long it would take to complete a new rulemaking on this issue?
Oh, I don't think it would take. I don't think it would take long at all. But I don't think right now there's a consensus at the commission. I think we're at an impasse.
Exactly. Okay. All right. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me talk about your anticipation of future needs. I'm glad that we both agree that the recent growth in the number of designated clearing organizations and swaps are only going to expand further. Can you outline CFTC's plan for keeping pace with industry? Do you have the financial and human resources necessary to get ahead of industry to ensure that consumers are protected? And along the same lines of anticipatory needs, with the UK's looming withdrawal from the EU, there's uncertainty on how Brexit will affect business planning and investment decisions of U.S. firms operating in the UK. So I'd venture to guess that this uncertainty translates into the commodity trading markets CFTC is responsible for overseeing. Do you have planning efforts CFTC has underway in preparation for Brexit's impact on the U.S. commodities markets, and if so, what are they? And in light of the perceived diminishing prominence of the U.S. in the global financial marketplace, what is CFTC doing to take a leadership role in influencing global commodity financial standards?
There's a lot of challenges in the world we live in today, and Brexit is certainly one of them. I know it's a great challenge for our colleagues in the UK and our colleagues in continental Europe to resolve the challenges that presents to their place in global financial markets. There's currently an issue as to whether the clearing that we've talked about before that takes place on the London Clearinghouse would be forced to relocate to continental Europe for at least the portion of the swaps market that's denominated in euros. And I have made the point that while we in the U.S. have historically been comfortable with regulating clearinghouses offshore in which U.S. market participants participate, if Europe were to take a different view, and that is that euro-denominated instruments need to be cleared on European soil, then it could rightly raise the question on the United States side, why are we comfortable with offshore clearinghouses if continental Europeans are not? And if the whole world were to go to that regime, I think that would actually be detrimental to global markets, to global trade, to the dollar standing as the world's reserve currency. So I think there are tremendous ramifications that come out of how the negotiators on both sides of the Brexit debate consider the consequences of this. And I don't envy their job, but I do hope that they get it right in the end.
Thank you. I was pleased to see that CFTC finalized rules that were proposed last year to protect whistleblowers. In particular, whistleblowers would be better protected from interference or retaliation by their employers, and CFTC would even be empowered to bring legal action against an employer who retaliated against an employee. I assume that in part this was to conform CFTC's rules on whistleblowers to those at the SEC. Beyond that, can you tell us what prompted the Commission to take this action, and also can you discuss the role that whistleblowers play in CFTC's work?
Thank you. Yes, it was done. I was proud to support those enhancements to our whistleblower program. It was done in part because we were cognizant of the SEC's rules, but it was also done because we felt it was the right thing to do. Whistleblowers play an important part in alerting us at the Commission to areas where we need to take enforcement action. That's not to say that whistleblowers always have it right. They need to be careful those enhancements along. As I said, I believe was the right thing to do, and they're now part of our framework.
Okay, let me talk about user fees. Previous CFTC chairmen have indicated support for funding some or all of the agency's costs with user fees. The National Futures Association, for example, is funded by those types of fees. In fact, NFA recently cut the amount of money it collected because it was getting too much. Every president since Ronald Reagan has proposed user fees. What is your position on user fee funding for CFTC?
This is an area where there is a broad range of views, and I know quite reasonable people, and as you say, every president since Ronald Reagan, although I don't think the current president has proposed user fees. But many people have proposed that, and a number of the agencies, financial regulatory agencies, like the SEC, also are paid with user fees. Our markets are a little different. Unlike the SEC's markets, which are primarily domestic, our markets are quite international in scope. Our markets also already have a form of user fees in NFA, which our registrants are required to be members of, and which charges user fees. Our markets have also seen a dramatic increase of transaction costs in the form of clearing costs, in the form of execution costs that have been brought on in the last few years. And our markets suffer right now from challenges in liquidity formation, something I've been talking about and writing about in great detail for the last 2.5 years. I'm very concerned that imposing transaction costs on our markets would contribute to greater liquidity challenges than we have now, and so I do not support user fees.
Thank you. I think my time has expired. Thank you very much.
Mr. Laurel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just repeat something that I said on the first go-round. If you could provide us with a big statement, and I know a lot of people take this statement seriously, that this is about the issue of regulation and how much regulation we should have or shouldn't and what's over-regulation. But how specifically, and you can please get back to us on this, has regulation of derivatives, of the derivatives market, held back the revival of American prosperity? And I would really like to see hard data, because otherwise, honestly, it becomes, and I'm not suggesting it's rhetoric on your part, but it certainly on our part often becomes rhetoric. So that would be enormously helpful. Just another point before I get to my question, which is I want to make sure that with the enforcement efforts that you are making, that the emphasis is about market users, as I said, their funds, consumers. How do we keep the public from being exposed to fraud, manipulation, and abusive practices that have been related to derivatives and to other products, and not make sure that enforcement focuses in that area and is not about a coziness, as I said, with the industry in that effort. I think that, robust oversight of derivatives, I believe this is not over-regulation. It's the right thing to do so that we don't have the crisis that we had with Wall Street and it's hurting Main Street. I believe that thanks to Dodd-Frank, we have more clarity into the derivatives market than ever before. More swaps trades take place on the swaps execution facilities and over the counter. Going back to an era where derivative trades could take place over the phone without any documentation more than a Post-it note. That's a recipe for a financial crisis. Let me just ask you, prior to Dodd-Frank, there was no way to track real-time data about trades happening in the swaps market. Now the swap data repositories created by Dodd-Frank capture and archive key information about every single trade so that we can identify problems that may arise in this multi-trillion-dollar market. Let me just, do you believe that a reform as straightforward and important as this is over-regulation?
So let me just absolutely be clear. I support Title VII of Dodd-Frank.
Right, you said that earlier.
I
yes.
support all of its elements. That is, moving bilateral swaps into central clearing, requiring that swaps trading take place on licensed platform, and the point you made, swap data reporting.
Right.
Completely support it. In fact, my only disappointment is that it's not great to realize that today, 9 years after the crisis, 7 years after Dodd-Frank was passed, that we still don't have the full transparency of swaps transactions through the swap data repository that Dodd-Frank promised. And I'm doing everything possible. We will soon put out a roadmap to completion of that project at the CFTC. I'm fully committed to that. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm so enthusiastic about financial technology is because it'll enable us to take it to what you just said, to real-time swap data analysis. Even if we complete the current project set out in Title VII, we won't get to real-time data analysis. It will still be after-the-fact data analysis, because swap repositories have to collect the data, scrub the data, provide the data, and then piece it together. We need to piece together our CFTC-regulated swaps with SEC-regulated swaps with European and Asian-regulated swaps. The blockchain could actually give us the opportunity to see all those swaps in real time. And so the financial technology, I think, is going to be the way we're going to get to realize the promise of Dodd-Frank, but I completely support it, completely.
Right, and I mean, I just make reference, you may have seen it, it's a tongue-in-cheek piece. It's an op-ed called "Dangerous Stability Threatens America's Banks." This was early in February. It's the editorial board of the Reformed Broker. I mean, I think that there's this move to look at how we unravel Dodd-Frank, which seems to be a movement here. I'm not suggesting that you're there, but we certainly are, and that's going to loom large this afternoon on the floor of the House. We have seen stability in the markets. Your agency is doing the job, though you don't have enough money to do the job that you have been charged with doing. We've paid back in a prior time, and we heard this from Mr. Massett in 2016. We got the $182 billion back from AIG, but the $182 billion is 600 times your budget request. So what your agency does is critically important. I do not want to get caught up with this notion that somehow the banks are suffering. They are not suffering. If there are people who are, we need to know who they are and how we can bring remedy to that, rather than looking at ways in which we can unravel the legislation that has created this stability, which it seems that sometimes our banks feel is too big a constraint on them. So thank you very, very much for your work.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for appearing for the subcommittee. I apologize for being a little late, but we're busy. I had just a couple of things. First of all, I just want to, I know the issue of the de minimis thresholds have been brought up. I'd just like to echo the concern that that the limits, especially if it reverts back to $3 billion, really would be pretty low. So just again, I just want to echo what you heard before. The only question I have for you really involves the fund, the consumer protection fund, I guess it's called, the commodity trade, Consumer Protection Whistleblower Fund. The balance I see is like $250 million, and even in Washington, that's a lot of money. I mean, basically, the balance in that fund exceeds the budget for the entire commission annually, and the payouts, I understand, have been peaking at around $20 million a year. So, you know, if you just do the math, I mean, you got a dozen years worth of payouts. If you had the maximum payouts you've had up until now, the peak payouts, at some point, given that we, run a $500 billion deficit, have a $20 trillion debt, Do you feel that at some point statutorily, we ought to be able to take the excess monies in the fund and perhaps and use it to fund the commission? I mean, what amount do you think you need? $250 million seems like a lot to keep in this fund.
Yeah, well, so our fiscal year 18 budget for use of that fund is about 15.7 million.
15?
15.
Yes.
So clearly, I think it's 238 million balance in the fund right now. Clearly, there's adequate resources for us to fund our whistleblower awards and our consumer protection. But that is something ultimately for your committee and for Congress to determine how that should be funded. But certainly it is adequate as it stands today and would be adequate at a lower level as well to fund our needs at the commission.
And you would need a statutory change, right, is my understanding?
That is my understanding as well.
Okay. Perhaps you can work on that, because we are looking for ways to, make sure that we would return monies to the federal taxpayers that perhaps are excessive in
We'll
accounts
share
like
with you,
this.
we are exploring ways that we can enhance our customer protection efforts to perhaps use that even more broadly. One of the areas that a number of your colleagues have been concerned about is the role of HFTs in markets, and we're looking to perhaps maybe conduct an open request for academic work on this, and perhaps even do some work in terms of hosting a conference where we can bring some of the best minds to bear on this, and perhaps some of that we could utilize some customer information and consumer information in that. But
Yeah,
as I say,
it would still be in excess.
we'd still be
Okay.
well within our
Thank you very
budget.
much. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Want to revert back, well, I say revert back, I'm not sure that we've actually talked, but back in last fall, the CFTC approached our committee here about ongoing negotiation with its labor unions. We were informed that these negotiations were under a worst-case scenario that could have resulted in the CFTC being forced to increase its financial commitments to $281 million. That is an increase of $31 million just to maintain the status quo and to satisfy the demands of the union's proposal. The negotiations could have resulted in furloughs of up to 17 days for CFTC staff. Essentially, it seems someone was sending a message that if this committee didn't increase the budget for CFTC, that the employees would suffer the consequences. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed in that situation, and the negotiation increased the agency's commitments by only a tiny fraction of that original $31 million. And I understand that no furloughs are going to happen. I don't know who was, of course, behind the effort to coerce Congress to increase the budget, but and certainly we don't want to focus too much on what all went on in the past. But we remain concerned about similar moves in the future. There's nothing preventing this from happening again. And let's be clear, neither this committee nor Congress will give in to manufactured crisis that we face in the last administration when making its funding decisions for CFTC. I'd like to explore how we can prevent this scenario from occurring in the future. According to the Congressional Research Service, quote, most federal employees cannot bargain over wages and benefits. Somehow, CFTC is part of a potential loophole in the federal law. My question would be to you, can you give us an update on the situation and how it is affecting your day-to-day operations?
Thank you for that. Since I've assumed the role as acting chairman, I've worked very hard. In fact, the very first call I made was to our union representative in Washington to signal to them that I desired good working relations with them, that the staff of the CFTC have chosen to be represented by a union. That was a decision that was made back in 2014 in Washington. In fact, the CFTC staff in New York have been represented by a union since the 1970s. And that is a choice that they've made, and so therefore we're obligated, as you know, under our statute to negotiate pay and benefits and other issues with them. And we have worked hard. We have approached those discussions in good faith. Again, when I took over, there was we were with the impasse panel over our 2016 pay and benefits, and we had still 17 to resolve and a collective bargaining agreement. We successfully have resolved the issues regarding 2016. We reached a good result with the union over 2017, and now we are getting ready to negotiate our collective bargaining agreement going into 2018. So I think that we have taken the right steps to come to a good place right now with our union. As I say, our employees have chosen to be represented by a union. We're required to negotiate with a good faith. Now, we have a commitment in our statute to pay and benefits equivalent to FIREA standards. And the union's very aware of that standard, and that is something that has come up, and I imagine will continue to come up in our negotiations with our union. That is our obligation. So we will endeavor to continue to be successful, to have a good working relationship, to negotiate and bargain in good faith. And I think the union is well aware that we are an appropriated agency, that we, if all our money goes to pay and benefits, at some point we will have a dwindling number of employees. So we have to get that balance right. I see they come to the table with an understanding of what's reasonable and what's not, and we do the same.
Is it possible to place a precondition or certain parameters on your future collective bargain agreements with the union through your current memorandum of understanding? For example, to prevent any negotiation for placing the agency employees at risk of furloughs or layoffs? Or do you need an act of Congress to close the loophole on this?
Well, I think in terms of reaching permanence, there's nothing better than an act of Congress. If we want to address this in a way that's permanent, I'd be happy to meet with my staff and take a look at it from a memorandum of understanding
At least
perspective.
a temporary standpoint.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Would be interested in following up with you on that. Okay, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. As you know, shortly after taking office, President Trump issued a series of executive orders related to regulations and government operations. Among other things, the administration required departments to appoint regulatory reform officers. Does that requirement apply to CFTC? If so, have you appointed a regulatory reform officer, and who is that person, and where do they report within the new organizational structure in Appendix 1 of your budget request?
Thank you very much. I'm advised by our counsel we're not strictly subject to that executive order as an independent agency. Nevertheless, we have adopted it in the spirit, and it's reflected in our initiative that I call Project KISS. And my chief of staff, Mike Gill, is our regulatory reform officer, or as I refer to him, he is stupid. And I say that jokingly because he's quite intelligent and also has taken this effort very much to heart. We have quite a few proposals in front of us to streamline our operations that we are now working through our divisions, and I'll be speaking about with my fellow Commissioner Bowen. But we take very much, I think, to heart the need, and I think it's quite frankly not a partisan need. I don't think it's a political need. I think all government agencies from time to time should take stock of the implementation of their rules to see whether they can be streamlined and done in a way that is most productive, quite frankly, most efficient in achieving the policy goals set by Congress.
Going back to Mr. Laura's questions in identifying regulatory burdens, CFTC operates under numerous rules and regulations, and this exercise is, well, let me ask you, is this exercise directed at Dodd-Frank, or is it a deeper dive into the various rules and regulations that you enforce? I agree that streamlining is beneficial to the solvency of our financial markets, but I ask you whether or not the current request of $281.5 million is sufficient to cover CFTC if it looks like a major overhaul is going to be called for. If it's not enough, were you provided a regulatory budget by OMB? And if so, how much? And to date, what progress has the task force made in reducing regulatory burdens without sacrificing your core mission to foster open competitive markets while protecting the public from fraud and manipulation? What's the adjudication process for comments and the ideas that are generated from the public? so that it won't turn into a never-ending land of good ideas, what is the expected implementation rollout date?
Thank you very much. So let me be very clear. Project KISS is not directed at Dodd-Frank. It is a general agency-wide initiative. Secondly, the budget request is not designed for any attempt to roll back Dodd-Frank. In fact, one component of it, the need for greater examiners, is reflective of the need that Dodd-Frank has put more swaps into clearinghouses, and we need to do a better job examining them. The other two components of it, more economists and a FinTech initiative, is really a forward-looking exercise. You know, to some degree, I've said in my testimony, I think the error of the era of Dodd-Frank implementation is now winding to a close. I really don't join in the debate as to Dodd-Frank good or bad. I accept it as done, and I'm moving forward into the future. My focus is on where do we go next? How do we digest what we've done and make it work in a way that's helpful for the U.S. economy? My former chairman, Tim Massad, admitted there's fine-tuning that needs to be done. There are tweaks and initiatives. There are areas of Dodd-Frank where I think Congress got right. I think the CFTC got some of the implementation wrong. There's other areas where we got it right. But, you know, we're still fine-tuning the Securities Acts that were passed 1933 and 34. We've still got to get them right. But the law is the law. There's nothing in the Choice Act that repeals Title VII. I haven't called for it. It's going to be the law, I'm sure, for the rest of my career. What I want to do is get the implementation of it right. And I want to start focusing on where things are going on into the future. As I've said, these markets are changing dramatically. And as comprehensive as Title VII and Dodd-Frank is, they don't address high-frequency trading. Dodd-Frank doesn't address cyber. And we haven't discussed cyber yet. Cyber is the biggest threat to our market. And unfortunately, Dodd-Frank doesn't give us any instructions as to what to do about the cyber threat to our market. So these are the things that really, going forward in our budget request, is to focus on the future, not on the past.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for being here today and for your testimony before our committee. We look forward to working with you. Again, we wish you the best in your confirmation process as it moves forward. And so with that, the subcommittee's hearing is adjourned.